disclosure here. It's been the end of a long day. Full disclosure here. I love this guy like a brother. He was in my wedding. We've known each other for, 20 some odd years.
That long?
We've
a long time.
We've been all over the world together, and I know I'm a writer, but he's my favorite writer in the tech business. And so part of what I want to make sure is that everybody reads his book. And I'm not only saying that because he's my buddy, but I'm an entrepreneur. I've been a CEO since I think I was 26 years old. And as an entrepreneurial CEO, I found that this is an amazing handbook, a very inspirational entrepreneurial handbook for CEOs or young CEOs. I'm no longer a young CEO. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have read The Facebook Effect?
Oh, that's a painful question.
I know. So this really upsets me. But you're gonna promise before you leave that you read this. We're going to talk today largely about the personality of Mark Zuckerberg and his abilities as a young CEO. Of course, this book is The Facebook Effect, and better than me, why don't you describe the access that you were given so people can appreciate how in depth you were able to talk to virtually everybody in the company.
Well, I think when you say what you said about it being a handbook, I didn't write it as a handbook, but I will say I think this book is one of the most inside stories that anybody's ever written about a semi-significant startup, because the access was essentially unlimited. I basically had every interview I wanted, including, 6 interviews with Zuckerberg, by a total of, 12 or 14 hours with him, something like that. And, they really wanted to have a responsible book written about them because, ironically, at the time when I started working on the book 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago almost, people really dismissed Facebook. And they felt sort of dissed. And they really wanted somebody to, get it so they could, tell the world, hey, this is not just a plaything. That has been remedied by Goldman Sachs, among other factors, recently. So that problem seems surprising in retrospect. But, in fact, the company really wanted me to write this book. And they worked really closely with me to give me every access I wanted, and they didn't tell me what to do. I say in the back there was no quid pro quo. They did not see the book before it was published or anything.
So you started the book when?
Well, 3 years ago last week was when I told Zuckerberg I wanted to write a book, and he said, go for it.
So
and I sold it in May of 2008, and I started writing it in August of 2008.
Okay, so when you came up with the idea for a book, it's interesting to note that I think Facebook was smaller in numbers than MySpace and even Princeton.
It was still smaller than MySpace. It was about 55 million at the beginning of 2008. But the reason I decided to write a book was I first started writing about Facebook and met Zuckerberg in September of 2006 when it was 9 million. And here it was 15 months later, and it was already at 55 million. That's when I said, I have never seen anything like this, in addition to feeling that what they did was pretty interesting. Just the sheer growth, even then, was unprecedented.
So one of the things I like to feel that we both have in common is that we have social consciousnesses.
And a clean bottle of water I can drink out of?
Yes. And so part of you, when you started the book, you started talking about the political implications of Facebook, and you told some great stories about that. And I don't want to get off on this tangent, but I do want to ask one thing is, we've witnessed this whole revolt in Egypt. So could you just kind of put it into a quick Facebook context?
Oh, I actually reread the first few pages of my book the other day to see how out of it sounds, considering what's happening in Tunisia and Egypt. And in fact, it's relatively relevant. I started the book with an example about a political result of Facebook in Colombia, which was also 3 years ago, when the largest demonstration at the time, probably in world history up till then, or at least around then, 10 million people had gone into the streets in Colombia against the FARC guerrilla movement, the terrorists, as they think of them. And that was organized out of Facebook. And, it was an early example of exactly what we're seeing in Egypt. In fact, on my page today, I have a page for the book called The Facebook Effect on Facebook, and I just posted 2 photos One, a photo was taken today in Cairo, and another, which is just a sea of humanity, and another photo that's actually from the book that was taken in Bogota in February of 2008, which is an amazing photo. Again, a sea of humanity. Every possible square inch of downtown Bogota taken from the air, filled with these little dots that are human beings, and it was precipitated by Facebook. This is a unique quality that Facebook has that is just starting to be kind of realized by leaders around the world. The interesting thing about that right now is that Facebook could get some serious governmental pushback now in a lot of the less democratic countries in which it operates, now that it is transparently clear that Facebook is a tool of democracy, or at least of a tool, maybe not a tool of democracy, but it's a tool of destroying the autocracy, shall we say. And autocrats still rule a very large number of the countries where Facebook operates. And I do think Facebook is perhaps going to be sorry that it has had such a success in Tunisia and Egypt over the next months and years, although I don't think that governments are going to stop it that easily, but it's not going to be welcomed the way it has been. You know, like in Vietnam, for example, where Facebook is technically illegal, but 3 million people use it, and it's so accepted that Facebook has an office there with like 4 employees. But Vietnam is a dictatorship of a sort, you know, and they may change their mind about whether they want to enforce the firewall a little more aggressively, and there's a lot of countries like that.
Okay, so now I'm going to take you through a series of things that I learned about Mark Zuckerberg in your book that really impressed me. These are basically decisions and strategies that he implemented that I personally feel were very counterintuitive to a certain level, and ended up, you know, really driving this great success of Facebook, and thereby makes what I believe Mark a very unique CEO, young CEO. I did way back when in Davos, before you start writing the book, got Zuckerberg, who came to my party, admit that without Friendster, there would have been no Facebook. Okay, so Friendster needs to get a lot of credit for being, you know, the first of a generation of social networks. But as we all know, or most of you know, there's a term, and it's called Friendsterized. And being Friendsterized.
That's the book that was in my. That was a term that Dustin Moskovitz used in my book for what they were afraid of. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah. You popularized that term.
Well, I've never heard it.
Everything that I know comes from you, David. So we can take that as a given.
It was a paranoia at Facebook to be Friendsterized.
Yeah. So Friendsterized. So what does that mean? I mean, what it means is that, you know, Friendster was so popular, but it was so ill-coded that basically the company failed not because people didn't like it or it wasn't popular, but because of technology.
They didn't have enough servers.
They didn't have enough servers, and it wasn't well architected. So in your book, you learn, and you know what's interesting now, all the entrepreneurs in this room, every service today is a web service, and you know runs the risk based upon the popularity of being Friendsterized. But here's this 20-year-old kid who, as far as I can remember from your book, made the decision first to Facebook, Harvard, and then slowly bring on new universities one at a time as a way to, you know, scale the business over time and lessen the risk of being Friendsterized. Is that an accurate vision?
Well, it wasn't exactly quite that deliberate, but that is what happened. I mean, they had a very kind of gift given to them by luck, which was that because they were a college-oriented service and they could turn on colleges incrementally, they didn't have to risk being overwhelmed with usage that they didn't want to accept. So basically, Facebook wanted to expand faster than it did at certain moments, but they were able to wait because each time they turned on a new college in the early days, their usage would spike until they had like 60 to 70% of all the students there within days. And so they just would, when they could afford the servers, they'd turn on the new school. And it's really one of the first times that kind of opportunity ever has existed for an internet company. Whereas internet companies generally, you know, it's sink or swim. You know, if you're popular, you damn well better be prepared for it if you're a consumer business. And that is what happened to Friendster. I actually think, though, that if Friendster hadn't had that problem, Facebook might never have come along. And Friendster could have been Facebook. It had a lot of the basics. It didn't have a leader like Mark Zuckerberg. I tell a story in my book about, what's his name? Jonathan Abrams. Yeah. I interviewed him for my book, and he offered me tequila 3 times in the interview while I'm sitting there with him. He's just like a little less serious than Zuckerberg. So maybe he couldn't have done it, but he did. As Sean Parker says in the book, Jonathan cracked the code for what a social network was, because he tried to make it identity-based, which was one of Facebook's fundamental differentiators. He couldn't enforce that, which was another problem, in addition to the server overload problem.
Okay. The other thing that I was very impressed by is that when you look at Facebook, Mark made a deliberately kept the Facebook logo very small, because his attitude was he wants the users to feel that this isn't a Facebook network, that this is their own personal network. And I think, us media guys love our logos and like to put them in people's faces, and, want nothing more than for people to know, to think about your logo and your brand name all the time. And he, it was counterintuitive to not build a big Facebook logo and stick it in your face, or dominate the web page, with the Facebook look. He kept it very simple and minimalistic.
So that's an interesting way to think of it. I mean, it is literally true that if you look at the history of the Facebook logo, it has shrunk considerably a number of times. The Facebook logo is a lot smaller now than it was 5 years ago. But I do think, I don't say in the book, and I think it's an intelligent analysis, that it's partly to make it feel more personal. The reason they say they've done that, and I do think one of the main reasons, is that they actually think long-term the platform is more important than the website. And they really don't want people to be too obsessed with being on Facebook. Now, in reality, they've had some second thoughts about that in the last year as the gaming business has taken off so successfully, and what they call the canvas applications, which is a new term they now use for things that are truly inside the firewall, like Zynga or Playfish or whatever, are so incredibly successful and lucrative for them that they're having a little bit less urgency in the sense of extending the platform as their primary business. But basically, the still long-term strategy of Facebook is that Facebook.com is not the business. The business is the platform. The business is maintaining the database and the social graph and nothing else, and basically making the business on that. And, as this guy, who was it up here before, was saying, it was David Pacman. I totally agree with everything he said about, the sources of revenue. The idea that Facebook is eventually going to have an ad distribution business is, a ad network business, is very, very real. They will do that, make no mistake. It's just a matter of how urgently. They have the tools to do one of the best, if probably by far the most accurate and effective ad distribution network the internet will have ever seen, because of all the profile data they have. They currently have 2.5 million websites that use Facebook platform APIs to some degree. Most of those are the like button. A lot of them are other things. So, that's a number that's growing fast. The last time I heard was like 2 million, then it's 2.5 million last week. So that if they don't want to really be Facebook.com, they don't want you to focus on the logo too much. That's
right. Again, I think that's counterintuitive.
You gave me a good excuse to say something I wanted to talk about anyway.
Okay, good.
This platform thing is radically underappreciated by most. Probably all of you are not casual observers of Facebook, but that is what they care about. They care about the platform. They do not care about Facebook.com long term, except if it's true that Zynga is sending them $30 million a month for their share of the credits that are being spent for Zynga Virtual Goods, which is the recent figure, and I think that's close to accurate. So there's almost $400 million a year Facebook is getting just for letting Zynga operate there. Well, they're not going to kill that golden, that goose too fast. And there's a bunch of other companies doing the same thing.
Okay, rewinding back in the company's history, and this probably has a little bit more to do, it's calculated luck, but Mark Zuckerberg decides, he's a sophomore at Harvard, and he says, I'm moving to Palo Alto, because that's where all his heroes were, Steve Jobs and whatnot, and it was supposed to be just for the summer. He came to town with 2 ideas for 2 different businesses, but he made sure and connected with one of his heroes, which is Justin Timberlake. Oh, I mean, Sean. Got to get that guy out of my brain here. Sean Parker, who was 25 at the time, had just been kicked out by Sequoia out of Plaxo, right? For the second time, he had founded Napster, which is why he was a hero of Mark Zuckerberg. And Sean taught him how to structure his company so that he remains control of that company even to this day. And as an entrepreneur, I love that. So is there any color to that?
Well, I think it is funny. And one of the things that I really think is funny, and I do try to hit on pretty hard in the book, is that it wasn't until Facebook had over 1 million users in about December of 2004 that Zuckerberg decided, yeah, this is probably the project I should focus on. He was working on Wirehog, which he thought was a more interesting business. His best friend Adam D'Angelo, who later became CTO, wasn't working on Facebook at all. He was only working on Wirehog, which was their sort of LimeWire kind of thing for all media, which was going to use the Facebook social graph. It was like the first app ever conceived for the Facebook platform. And they really wanted to do that, and it was Parker that convinced them not to do it. I love that story. Zuckerberg had to really reluctantly be convinced by Dustin and Sean not to focus so much on Wirehog. And hey, this thing is growing. Focus on this thing. And that seems really ludicrous in retrospect, but that wasn't very long ago. And what was the question? That was just
it was just about how the Justin Timberlake guy.
Well, Sean was the bigger. The one thing the movie gets right, the movie is so wrong about the personalities of these people.
Right.
It's so wrong. But one thing it really gets right was the degree to which Sean believed in Facebook's potential at that key early moment. And that dinner scene, which is got a few accurate elements in it. It's got some bullshit too. But in that dinner scene where Sean says, 1 million isn't cool, 1 billion is cool. He really did help Zuckerberg realize that this was a bigger opportunity than just a college service. And in fact, I have a quote in the book where Sean says, Mark had megalomaniacal tendencies. He wanted to rule the world, but for him, the world was college. He didn't really even know there was a world bigger than college. And Sean was already 25, like you said, and he knew there was a bigger world than college, and he very, very concretely realized that Facebook had the opportunity to rule that world, and he made Mark believe that, and he still is a big factor in a lot of the zeitgeist that Facebook has. I mean, Sean is a very big picture thinker. I wrote a profile of him in Vanity Fair, which was, I think tried to explain a little bit of he is a uniquely visionary leader in tech, and he deserves a lot of credit for Facebook. If there's any other real co-founder of Facebook, it is Sean Parker.
Okay, I want to get back to my pro-entrepreneurial riff here and the ownership thing, because I think what's cool, and before I get into what's cool about it or what's really cool about it, is can you explain the structure? He basically designed it so Mark controlled board seats. Right?
Yeah, Mark has 3 out of 5 board seats now, and that's it. That's absolute. That's autocracy. Mark is a dictator. Nothing happens at Facebook that he doesn't want. He's also got the 2-class stock structure that he modeled after the Washington Post. So even after a possible IPO, which I don't think he wants anytime soon if he can avoid it, but if it does happen, he's got the Class B shares with 10 votes per share as opposed to the Class A, which only has 1 vote. So he will always control Facebook unless something really unexpected happens, and I don't think it's in prospect. And that was Sean. Sean hated Sequoia so much, and he hated what had happened. He hated basically Hummer Windblad also. And he just basically didn't want – I mean, the very first meeting they had on the streets and that night, Sean was being kicked out of Plaxo in real time that day and losing his options. And Zuckerberg – I tell the story, Zuckerberg and